The wind off the North Sea cut like a blade as the landing craft scraped onto the shingle at Vogsoy. It was the morning of December the 27th, 1941, and Captain Peter Young of No. 3 Commando had perhaps 30 seconds before the Germans in the warehouses ahead understood that Christmas was over. He understood it already. Crouched in the lee of the bow ramp, Bergen rucksack heavy with Mills bombs, Thompson's submachine gun cradled across his knees, Young listened to the whoomp of the Hamptons overhead, laying smoke, and waited for the ramp to drop. Behind him, 200 men in cap comforters and woolen battle dress, faces blackened with burnt cork, were quietly clicking magazines into Bren's. Not one of them spoke. They had rehearsed this for months on the Scottish lochs around Achnacarry, where Lord Lovat's instructors had taught them that silence on a beach was worth more than any artillery barrage. The ramp dropped. The shingle exploded into a sprint of nailed boots, and within 4 minutes the first German machine gun nest above the South Vauxhall Road had been silenced by a single grenade and a burst from the hip. Within an hour, the fish oil factories, feeding glycerin into German munitions plants, were burning so fiercely that the smoke could be seen from 20 miles out at sea. The Kriegsmarine patrol vessel Föhn was sunk at her moorings. A coastal battery was blown apart with its own ammunition. And 150 German prisoners, dazed and frostbitten, were being herded onto British landing craft before their headquarters in Bergen had finished decoding the first frantic radio signal. Operation Archery lasted less than 5 hours. It killed 120 Germans, destroyed 16,000 tons of shipping, and humiliated the garrison of an entire occupied coastline. When the reports reached Berlin, Adolf Hitler did something extraordinary. He ordered 30,000 additional troops, 2 new coastal artillery regiments, and the eventual construction of the Atlantic Wall, 3,000 miles of concrete and steel, to defend against an enemy who had numbered, that morning, fewer than 600 men. This is the story of how a hastily formed, ill-equipped, and politically inconvenient British raiding force came to be described in the captured private correspondence of senior Wehrmacht and Kriegsmarine officers as the single most dangerous unit fielded by any combatant nation during the Second World War. Not the most numerous, not the best equipped, the most dangerous. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, in a memorandum to OKW in the spring of 1944, would write that the British commandos pinned down 10 times their own number along the coasts of Europe, and that he could never know from one foggy night to the next where they would next come ashore. How did Churchill's butcher and bolt experiment, dismissed by his own War Office in 1940 as little more than legalized piracy, evolve into the unit that taught the rest of the world how to fight in the shadows? How did men recruited from the bored, the disillusioned, and the merely homicidal end up wearing the green beret that every elite force from Hereford to Coronado would later seek to imitate? And why, after the war, did German officers writing their memoirs in Allied captivity return again and again to the same haunted phrase, those men in the woolen caps who came at night? The answers begin not on a Norwegian beach, but in a war cabinet meeting room in June 1940, with a prime minister staring at a map of a continent he had just lost, looking for any weapon, however unorthodox, however ruthless, that might allow Britain to fight back. June 1940 was the month Britain learned what it meant to stand alone. The British Expeditionary Force had been pulled, half-drowned and weaponless, from the beaches of Dunkirk. France had fallen with a speed that defied military comprehension. The Low Countries were occupied, Norway was lost. Italy had declared war, and from Narvik to Biarritz, the entire Atlantic coastline of Europe was now in German hands. The Royal Navy still ruled the waves. The RAF was preparing to contest the skies above Kent and Sussex, but the British Army, the instrument by which any continental war must ultimately be won, had ceased, for practical purposes, to exist as an offensive force. In the corridors of Whitehall, the mood was something close to numb. The Joint Intelligence Committee estimated that a German invasion could come within 6 weeks. The chiefs of staff, meeting in their bunker beneath Storey's Gate, were drawing up contingency plans for the evacuation of the royal family to Canada and the scuttling of the home fleet in Scottish locks. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary until that May, had argued openly for exploring peace terms through the Italian ambassador. The country was tired, frightened, and, though it would never admit it publicly, uncertain that it could win. Into this atmosphere stepped Winston Churchill. 3 weeks into the premiership, he had wanted all his life, and now half suspected might be the shortest in British history. He had read the Dunkirk casualty returns. He had seen the photographs of abandoned material, 600 tanks, 20,000 vehicles, 90,000 rifles, rusting in the dunes. And he had concluded, with the clarity that came to him in moments of catastrophe, that defensive thinking would lose the war. Britain had to attack. Somewhere. Anywhere. Even if the attacks were pinpricks, the country needed to feel itself once more the aggressor. On June 4th, the very day the last destroyer left Dunkirk harbour, Churchill dictated a minute to General Sir John Dill, the new chief of the Imperial General Staff. We should immediately set to work to organise raiding forces on these coasts, where the populations are friendly. Such forces might be composed of self-contained, thoroughly equipped units. There comes from the sea, from time to time, a hand of steel which plucks the German sentries from their posts. The phrase was vintage Churchill. The military reality behind it was almost laughable. There were no such units. There was no doctrine. There were no specialized landing craft. The Royal Marines were stretched defending dockyards, and the regular army, having lost its equipment, was reduced to drilling with broomsticks and gas-pipe rifles in the fields of Surrey. What Britain did possess, however, was a tradition. The Boer Commandos, who had bled Kitchener's columns dry on the South African veldt 40 years earlier, had given the language a word. T.E. Lawrence's irregulars had shown in the Hejaz what mobility and audacity could achieve against a sclerotic conventional enemy. The Irish flying columns of 1920 had taught, painfully, for the British, what determined small units could do behind the lines. And in Whitehall there were officers who had read these lessons. Lieutenant General Sir Alan Bourne, the Royal Marines officer first tasked with raising the force, and shortly thereafter Sir Roger Keyes, the hero of Zeebrugge in 1918, brought to the project a willingness to discard the rulebook that the regular army deeply resented. The army, indeed, hated the entire idea. Senior officers complained that elite units would skim the cream of the regiments, that private armies were un-British, that the whole concept smacked of buccaneering. The Adjutant General called it a waste of fine soldiers. Brooke, when he arrived at the War Office, was sceptical for years. But Churchill had decided, and in that summer of 1940, what Churchill decided happened. The first call for volunteers went out in mid-June 1940, distributed quietly to commanding officers throughout home forces. It asked for men prepared to undertake service of a hazardous nature, a phrase calculated to weed out the merely curious. Within a fortnight, more than 2,000 had stepped forward. They were sergeants from Highland regiments and corporals from London infantry battalions, gunners who had escaped from Calais with nothing but their pistols, signallers who had swum the canals of Belgium, and a striking number of professional men, bank clerks, schoolmasters, journalists, who had enlisted at the outbreak and were finding ordinary soldiering insufficient to their fury. What was unusual about the Commandos from the outset was that they were not formed as regiments. They were not even formed as battalions in the traditional sense. Each commando, there would eventually be 12 numbered Army Commandos and 4 Royal Marine Commandos, was a self-contained unit of around 500 men, divided into 10 troops of 50, designed to be split, recombined, or detached as the operation required. The men lived not in barracks, but in civilian billets, paid a daily allowance to find their own lodgings in the Scottish villages near the training areas. They were responsible for their own discipline, their own kit, their own punctuality. Slovenliness was punished not with detention, but with a single, devastating sanction: RTU, return to unit. There were no second chances. The training, when it crystallized under the direction of Brigadier Charles Haydon, and later the legendary Lieutenant Colonel Charles Vaughan at Achnacarry in the Western Highlands, was unlike anything the British Army had ever attempted. Recruits arrived by train at Speen Bridge and were ordered to march the 7 miles to the castle with full kit. Those who fell out were RTU'd before they reached the gates. They ran up Ben Nevis. They swam Loch Lochy in December in battle dress. They crawled through assault courses while live bren rounds cracked inches above their helmets. They learned silent killing from William Fairbairn and Eric Sykes, the 2 former Shanghai policemen whose double-edged fighting knife, issued to every man, would become the unit's symbol. They abseiled from cliffs, demolished bridges with plastic explosive, navigated by stars, and were taught to identify every variant of German uniform, rank insignia, and small arm by touch, alone in pitch darkness. The casualty rate in training was deliberately accepted. 40 men died at Achnacarry over the course of the war, drowned, shot, killed by their own grenades. Vaughan considered it a cost of producing soldiers who would not panic when the real shooting started. Better a coffin at Speen Bridge, he said, than a corpse on a German beach. Watching all of this from the other side of the Channel, with mounting unease, was the Wehrmacht. Initial German intelligence assessments in the summer of 1940 had dismissed reports of British shock troops as propaganda, the desperate inventions of a defeated army. The first raid, Operation Collar, against Boulogne on the night of June 24, 1940, had been almost farcical. 120 men, 4 landing craft, a few skirmishes in the dunes, no significant damage. Berlin had laughed. By the autumn of 1941, Berlin was no longer laughing. The man whose appointment in October 1941 would transform the Commandos from a nuisance into a strategic weapon was Vice Admiral Lord Lovat Mountbatten, a glamorous, ambitious, politically connected naval officer, the King's cousin, a friend of Churchill, a destroyer captain who had been bombed out from under 3 commands and lived to tell the tale. Mountbatten took over combined operations from the aging Keys and brought to it a flair for publicity, a hunger for action, and a willingness to spend lives that would shortly become a matter of bitter controversy. His German counterpart, in a sense, was Field Marshal von Rundstedt, charged with defending the entire Atlantic seaboard. By December 1941, Rundstedt was already requesting reinforcements he could not get. The hand of steel was about to close. The raid on Vogsoy in December 1941 was the moment everything changed. Until that morning, the commando concept had been on probation. The army still resented the unit. The Admiralty viewed combined operations as an unwelcome competitor for landing craft it could ill spare. Even Churchill, whose enthusiasm for the project remained intact, had been forced to defend it before a sceptical war cabinet that wanted to know what, precisely all this expensive training was for. The raids to date, Guernsey in July 1940, the Lofoten Islands in March 1941, had achieved modest results. The Germans had recovered quickly. The British press had reported them as triumphs, but in the corridors of Whitehall the figures did not yet add up. Archery added them up. What made Vogsoy different was not the tonnage destroyed or the prisoners taken. It was the shape of the German response. Within 72 hours, signals intercepted by the government code and cipher school at Bletchley Park, the famous Enigma decrypts that even most cabinet ministers did not know existed, revealed that Hitler personally had intervened. He ordered the immediate transfer of an entire infantry division to garrison duty along the Norwegian coast. He demanded that coastal artillery be doubled. He ordered the construction of fortified observation posts every 2 kilometers from the North Cape to Stavanger. And he issued a Führer Directive, number 40, dated March 23, 1942, which formalized the entire concept of the Atlantic Wall. A continuous belt of fortifications from Norway to the Spanish frontier, manned eventually by over 1 million German soldiers. In Whitehall, when the Joint Intelligence Committee's analysis of these intercepts landed on Churchill's desk in the new year of 1942, the implications were immediate. 600 British commandos, operating for 5 hours, had caused the diversion of 500,000 German troops to static defensive duties. The arithmetic of strategic economy of force had rarely produced such a return. Mountbatten took the figures to the Chiefs of Staff Committee. Within weeks, combined operations had its expanded budget, its priority claim on landing craft production at the Vickers Yards on the Clyde, and, crucially, its remit broadened. The Commandos would no longer simply raid. They would be the tip of the spear for every major amphibious operation Britain undertook for the rest of the war. The escalation, however, brought a darker development. In October 1942, infuriated by the increasing tempo and audacity of British raids, particularly the small-scale Operation Basalt on Sark, where commandos had killed German prisoners whose hands had been tied, Hitler issued the Commando Befehl, the Commando Order. It was perhaps the most extraordinary document of his war. It directed that all captured Allied commandos, whether in uniform or not, whether armed or not, whether surrendered or not, were to be executed immediately. No trial, no prisoner of war status, no mercy. The order was illegal under every accepted convention of war, and the senior officers who signed it, Jodl, Keitel, would hang for it at Nuremberg. But for the men who wore the green beret, it meant that capture now equaled death. Many British commando officers, briefed on the order through ultra-decrypts in the late autumn of 1942, drew a particular conclusion. If the Germans were going to murder them anyway, there was no longer any tactical reason for restraint. Surrender ceased, in many minds, to be an option for either side. The fighting in the small hours, on the rocky inlets and beaches of occupied Europe, became correspondingly brutal. It was against this backdrop, the green beret marked for death, the German garrisons growing every month, the Atlantic Wall rising in concrete, that the commandos prepared for what would become the most controversial operation of their war, the raid on the dry dock at Saint-Nazaire. The dry dock at Saint-Nazaire, on the Loire estuary on the Atlantic coast of France, was the only facility on the entire western seaboard of Europe large enough to accommodate the German battleship Tirpitz. If Tirpitz, sister ship to the sunken Bismarck, could be lured into the Atlantic to attack the convoys upon which Britain's survival depended, she would need that dock to refit and repair. Without it, she was effectively confined to Norwegian fjords. Destroy the dock, the great form écluse, a kilometre long, with caissons of steel and concrete 40 feet thick. And Tirpitz became a strategic irrelevance. The Royal Navy had been studying the problem for 18 months. They had concluded it was impossible. The Commandos disagreed. Operation Chariot, mounted on the night of March 27, 1942, was the most audacious raid in British military history. The plan, developed jointly by Combined Operations and the Admiralty, was almost insane in its simplicity. An obsolete American-built destroyer, HMS Campbelltown, would be filled with 4.5 tons of high explosive, disguised as a German Mu-class torpedo boat, and rammed at full speed into the outer caisson of the dock. 346 commandos of No. 2, Commando under Lieutenant Colonel Augustus Charles Newman, carried aboard Campbelltown, and a flotilla of small motor launches would land in the harbour, destroy the pumping stations and lock gates, and fight their way out through the streets of an occupied French town garrisoned by 5,000 German troops. They sailed from Falmouth on March 26th, flying the German naval ensign, signalling in German Morse, with a young German-speaking officer answering the searchlights of the harbour batteries as they made their final approach up the Loire. The deception worked for precisely 6 minutes. At 1:34 hours on March 28th, less than a mile from the caisson, a German signaller noticed something wrong with the ship's silhouette. Star shells went up. The flotilla lowered the German flag, hoisted the white ensign, and opened fire with every gun aboard. What followed was as close to Trafalgar as anything fought in the 20th century. Campbelltown, hit dozens of times, her bridge a wreck, her Captain Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty navigating by memory through smoke and burning launches, rammed the caisson at 20 knots at 1:34.5. The impact drove her bow 33 feet into the gate. The commandos aboard scrambled down nets onto the dockside and went to work with their satchel charges, fighting room by room through the pump house and the winding station. The motor launches in the harbour were massacred. Of 16 that had set out, only 2 would return to England. The river ran with burning petrol. Commandos who reached the dock and completed their demolitions found themselves cut off. The boats meant to take them off were sunk or in flames. Newman gave the order to break out on foot, through the town, towards Spain, 600 miles away. Of the men who landed, 215 were captured. 64 were killed. Only 5 eventually made it home. But the dock died. At noon the following day, with German officers conducting a triumphant tour of the captured Campbelltown for war correspondents and Kriegsmarine dignitaries, the 4.5 tons of Amatol in her bow detonated. The blast killed 360 Germans on the spot and tore the caisson in half. The form écluse would not function again until 1948. 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded, the highest number for any single operation in British military history. And Tirpitz, the great fear of the Atlantic, never sailed against the convoys. In Berlin, the naval staff was forced to acknowledge, in writing, that the British have demonstrated an ability to strike at any point on the European coast with a force out of all proportion to its size. The price the commandos paid for their reputation was paid largely in young men. Of the roughly 25,000 soldiers and Marines who passed through the Green Beret during the war, more than 1,700 were killed in action and approximately 2,500 wounded, a casualty rate for the most active units in excess of 50%. No. 3 Commando, which had led the assault at Vogsoy and would later spearhead the Sicily landings, lost 3 commanding officers in succession. No. 4 Commando, immortalized at Dieppe and Sword Beach, suffered 75% casualties on D-Day alone. The young men in the woolen caps were, statistically, more likely to die than the bomber crews of Harris's Bomber Command, and that is the bleakest comparison the Second World War affords. The political costs, too, were considerable. The catastrophe at Dieppe on August 19th, 1942, Operation Jubilee, in which 6,000 men, the bulk of them Canadian, but including significant commando contingents under Lord Lovat and Major Jock Durnford Slater, were thrown against the fortified French port for reasons that have been argued about ever since, left almost 4,000 casualties on the beaches before noon. The Commandos themselves performed brilliantly. Number 4, Commando, attacking the Hesse battery at Varengerville under Lovat's command, executed what the official historian later called the most perfect small unit assault of the war. But the wider operation was a bloodbath, and Mountbatten, who had championed it and signed off on its planning, would spend the rest of his life defending his role in it. The Canadian government, which had lost so many of its sons that morning, never quite forgave him. There were intelligence costs, too, that were not widely understood at the time. Several of the early raids, Bruneval, in February 1942, when Major John Frost's airborne troops snatched a Würzburg radar set from a Norman clifftop and brought it home for British boffins to dissect, had yielded invaluable technical intelligence, but others had compromised SOE networks in occupied countries. After Saint-Nazaire, the Gestapo descended upon the Loire region with characteristic ferocity, rolling up resistance circuits that had taken months to build. The local population, who had received the commandos as liberators in the small hours of March 28th, paid in deportations and executions. This was a moral arithmetic that haunted the planners in Norfolk House for the rest of the war. There was, perhaps most insidiously, a cost to the army itself. The Commandos' very success vindicated the arguments of those traditionalists who had warned that elite units would distort the wider force. The best NCOs, in-line infantry regiments, volunteered for the Green Beret and were lost to their parent units. Quality of leadership in some Highland and Rifle battalions noticeably declined. General Sir Bernard Paget, Commander-in-Chief Home Forces from 1941, complained bitterly that he was running an army denuded of its sergeants and corporals because they were all playing pirates on the locks. After the war, both Field Marshal Slim and Field Marshal Montgomery, neither of them men given to easy agreement, would converge on the view that special forces, while useful, had been overdone in Britain's case, and that 10 ordinary battalions properly trained were worth more than 2 extraordinary ones. Yet against these costs must be weighed the strategic ledger. By the eve of D-Day, in June 1944, German calculations captured by Allied intelligence, the so-called Foreign Armies West documents, estimated that fully a third of the Wehrmacht's defensive deployment in the West was orientated against British coastal raiding. Hundreds of thousands of German troops, hundreds of guns, thousands of vehicles sat in concrete bunkers from Norway to the Pyrenees, waiting for an enemy who, on any given night, numbered fewer men than a single Wehrmacht regiment. It was, in the cold mathematics of war, the best return Britain ever got on a small investment. When the Commandos waded ashore at Sword Beach in the small hours of June 6th, 1944, with Lord Lovat's piper, Bill Millin, playing Highland Laddie through the surf, despite German machine gun fire, a moment that would become one of the iconic images of the entire war. The unit was no longer an experiment. It was an established part of the British order of battle, and it was about to enter its most punishing chapter. The commando brigades fought through Normandy, across the Seine, through the Netherlands, at Walcheren in November 1944. where Number 4 Commando Brigade assaulted the fortified island in conditions so appalling that historians still struggle to find adequate parallels, and across the Rhine in Montgomery's final operation of the European War. They were, by 1945, the most experienced amphibious infantry on Earth. And then, with a swiftness that astonished even those who had served in them, the Army Commandos were disbanded. The decision, taken by the new Labour government of Clement Attlee in late 1945 under pressure from a treasury appalled at the cost of the wartime establishment, dissolved the wartime numbered commandos almost overnight. The role of British amphibious shock troops was transferred entirely to the Royal Marines, a settlement which, although bitterly resented by the Army veterans, has endured to this day. The Green Beret, the Fairbairn Sykes knife, the cap comforter, the entire culture and ethos passed to the Corps. By 1947, what had been a dozen Army commandos was 3 Royal Marine Commando units, eventually constituted as 3 Commando Brigade. The wider influence, however, was only beginning. American officers attached to combined operations during the war, men like William J. Donovan of the OSS and the young Lieutenant Colonel William Darby, had taken what they learned from Achnacarry and Inverary and used it to build the United States Rangers, who trained at the British facilities under British instructors. The doctrine, the selection process, the very vocabulary, stick, troop, Rupert, migrated across the Atlantic. After the war, the same migration would shape the formation of every major Western Special Forces unit. The Special Air Service, founded in the desert by David Sterling in 1941 as a separate enterprise, drew much of its early personnel and almost all of its training infrastructure from the commando establishment. The American Green Berets, formed in 1952, Delta Force in 1977, the French Naval Commandos, the Dutch Corps Commandotroepen, the Israeli Sayeret Matkal, all trace lineage, directly or indirectly, to a stone-built castle in the Western Highlands. For Britain specifically, the strategic legacy was more complicated. The post-war era was one of imperial retreat. Palestine, India, Malaya, Suez, Aden, Kenya, Cyprus, Borneo, the Falklands, and at every one of these flashpoints, the Royal Marine Commandos and the Special Air Service appeared. They were, increasingly, the instruments by which a diminished imperial power continued to project force in places where conventional formations would have been politically or logistically impossible. The Cold War, in particular, gave them new purposes, from the patrolling of the inter-German border with the British Army of the Rhine to the long, brutal anti-IRA campaign in Northern Ireland, to the reconnaissance and demolition role NATO planned for them in the event of Soviet invasion of Norway's North Cape. When Margaret Thatcher's government dispatched the task force to the South Atlantic in April 1982, 3 Commando Brigade went with it, and the men who yomped across East Falkland in winter blizzards with 80-pound packs on their backs were the direct lineal heirs of those who had landed at Vogsoy 4 decades earlier. The same berets, the same knives, the same culture of silence on a beach. The hand of steel had a longer reach than Churchill had ever imagined. It is worth pausing, 80 years on, to ask why the Commandos became what they became. There were, after all, German equivalents, the Brandenburgers, who pulled off astonishing coups in the early months of the war. There were Italian frogmen of the Decima Flottiglia, MAS, whose attacks on Royal Navy capital ships at Alexandria in December 1941 nearly turned the strategic balance of the Mediterranean. There were Soviet naval infantry, Japanese paratroopers, American Rangers. Why, of all of them, did German officers single out the British commandos in their memoirs and intelligence assessments as the most dangerous? The answer, I think, lies in three things, none of them obvious. The first was institutional patience. Britain raised these units in the summer of 1940 when she had nothing else, and she stuck with them through Dieppe, through Saint-Nazaire, through Tobruk, through the failures and the public relations disasters and the treasury raids on the budget. Other nations raised special forces and then disbanded or absorbed them when the strategic emergency passed. Britain, perhaps because she remained for so long the weaker partner in the alliance and needed the leverage that small, audacious units provided, kept faith with the concept. The investment of years, of careers, of accumulated tradecraft paid dividends no other combatant matched. The second was selection. The men who passed through Akhnakari were not chosen for strength or intelligence alone, though both were tested, but for a quality the instructors called going on. It was the willingness to continue when the body had stopped being able to continue, the refusal to quit a task even when quitting was the obvious option. It is a quality very nearly impossible to test for, and the British, perhaps because of their long imperial experience with hard places and harder weather, had developed a remarkable instinct for finding it. The third was a culture of mission command. The commandos were trained from the first day to operate without orders. A troop commander whose officer was killed was expected to take over and complete the task. A corporal whose troop commander was killed was expected to do the same. A private soldier alone in an enemy town, separated from his stick, was expected to find his way to the rendezvous and continue the mission. This was foreign to the regular British Army of the period, which still operated on a Victorian model of detailed orders passed down a hierarchy. The commandos were, in this respect, ahead of their time by perhaps 30 years. Add these three together, patience, selection, initiative, and you have what the Wehrmacht's senior officers, writing in defeat, could not stop returning to. They had been fought, repeatedly and across years, by an enemy they could not predict, could not corner, and could not deter. 500,000 German troops watched empty beaches because of the Green Beret. And when Hitler issued his commando order, he confessed in a single document what every German general by then suspected, that there was no honorable way to fight these men because they had already redefined what fighting was. Britain has a habit of forgetting her own military innovators. The commandos are remembered now mostly through Royal Marines tradition, through Remembrance Sunday wreaths, through the granite memorial at Speen Bridge that bears the names of those who never came back from the Highlands. It is too easy a forgetting. 80 years after Vogsoy, the units they inspired remain the gold standard against which every special force on earth is still measured. What do you think about Britain's hand of steel? Did the commandos earn their reputation, or did they pay too high a price for it? Let me know in the comments. If you found this story worth your evening, give the video a like and subscribe for more from the long, complicated, often hidden history of how Britain fought her wars. Until next time.